Hello and welcome back to the Brompton Guy. Today we are going to cover 5 issues that may be hiding inside a used Brompton. Now, I've already covered the subject of used Bromptons before, but now that I've gained more experience from dismantling, rebuilding and maintaining Bromptons, I can see 5 common themes that always need to be replaced or addressed after a couple of years of use. Now, I feel it's important to share this with you so that if you are in the market for a used Brompton, you can either A, factor in the repair cost and if it's worth your time, or if it does make sense to just either get that new Brompton or one from a trusted reseller that has some form of warranty on it. So let's dive straight into issue number 1, which is the seat post sleeve. The seat post sleeve is located in the top of the main frame and its function is simple. The seat post sleeve is simply there to hold your seat post in place while you are riding on the bike. The seat post sleeve is made of plastic and is also noted on the Brompton website that it is a part that will wear out and require replacement. Now, as I just stated, the part's simply made of plastic. It's a small cylinder plastic shape and fits inside the main frame. Sounds simple and cheap to replace, right? The part itself is in the region of £9 to £10, and getting the old part out isn't actually too difficult and doesn't require anything specialist to do it. However, the fitting of the new part is a different story. In order to fit the part yourself, you would have to buy some specialist tools such as a reamer tool in order to make the seat post fit the new sleeve itself. It's for this reason it is way more economically viable to take it to a repair shop and have them do it. I've actually just recently done it on my used Brompton because I took it out and didn't know it was so intrusive to fit the new one itself. They charged me a total of £47 to have that repair done for the part, labour and everything. And I was without my bike for 3-4 days, which actually is quite a good turnaround, but it is a factor that you want to put in because it's probably one of the most worn parts on a Brompton when you bear in mind the saddle goes up and down all the time and is physically clamped into position. So after 3 to 4 years of use, it probably is something that you might have to consider changing. The second part to be cautious of is the bottom bracket. The bottom bracket is the absolute workhorse of any bike. It brutes all your hardcore power through the pedals and it is one of the first parts to get hit by the brutal weather here in Britain. It takes in all the rain and absolute everything that our elements throw at it. And it's for this reason that if it isn't maintained and that if it isn't changed out and if it isn't been looked after, the part itself will start to rust. Now, the sign of a worn bottom bracket is usually fairly obvious. Your pedal efficiency is usually significantly worse and you just genuinely feel when you're cranking it's taking more effort. And more commonly, when you have that horrible squeak on a bike and you just can't really quite isolate it, I would say a good 8 to 9 times out of 10, it is your bottom bracket. Now, you can't inspect the bottom bracket before buying the bike because it does actually require a fair level of work and again specialist tools to swap the bottom bracket out. The bottom bracket part itself is in the region of £27 to £30 depending where you buy it from, but again the specialist tools add up. In order to change a bottom bracket, you're going to need a crank remover to take the cranks off and you're going to need a specialist tool in order to actually disengage the bottom bracket and replace it. Not to then even mention you're going to need some grease and some Loctite to refit all the parts. By the time you add all that up, you've added about another £45 to £60 depending on what tools you buy for the job. And even if you take it to a shop, you are going to be in it for similar money on that side. Point number 3, and arguably could be point number 1, is the braking system. Yes, as we covered in the last used video, you can simply check the wear on the pads and the wear on the rim. You can squeeze the levers and check the action. But that's you only doing a visual inspection of what you can see, like most service centres will do. I was horrified to discover on breaking down 2 Bromptons that both brake cables were extremely corroded. The physical cable was extremely white and had blue tinges all over it. Now, while that's not particularly an issue itself, it could lead to the cable snapping. And more importantly, on the vintage Brompton that I rebuilt, on the 2004 model, it completely corroded in the brake lever, which meant if I tried to adjust the levers, It was physically impossible to do. As soon as I tried to release that, the bolt snapped and realistically made the brakes rendered useless. I couldn't even get the part from Brompton to fix that unit of brake anymore. So I was left with having to get a whole new set of brakes in order to address that. But let's look at the better case scenario. Let's say you want to replace the brake cables. Your best case to do that is in the region of around £26 to replace both cables. However, let's have the obvious assumption if your brake cables are fairly heavily corroded, the likelihood is you might have to replace the other cables in the bike also. And when it comes to safety, brakes are number one. So changing a brake cable isn't actually all that expensive or hard to do, and at £26, you should probably factor for your own safety that that is something you'd want to do when you buy a bike that's definitely over at least 3 to 4 years old. Point number 4, can any of you guess it? I'll give you enough time there. Is the rear hub itself. The rear hub is obviously enclosed and protected from the elements, but after miles and miles of use, or even just sitting stagnant, the hub itself does require service to have its grease and oil all redone. It doesn't have any way to exit, so all that stuff just stays in there and keeps grinding away over time. Now, you cannot have any form of inspection of the hub, and one way to know if your hub is starting to fail is potentially that your shifting is getting worse or it's audibly noisy at the back. Now, when I talk about resistance to drag, that could either be coming from the bottom bracket, it could be coming from the rear hub. It's very hard to isolate down, and a lot of people might just put the issue as to, oh no, I can't index the bike correctly, it's the cable that's wrong, I'm not quite sure how to index. But sometimes your rear hub itself just needs a service. I mean, it is also recommended to have your hub serviced over specific mileage periods, but that is very dependent on the hub you have. Now, with a used bike, you have no idea how many miles that bike has actually travelled, or if it has actually genuinely ever been serviced. But if you wanted to factor a service cost in for the hub, then you are looking in the region of anywhere from £50 up to £90, depending on what hub that you have. So it's certainly a factor to take in, and I think it's hopefully obvious by now how much of this starts to mount up when you already factor the cost of the used bike in. Reason number 5. If that hasn't been enough to make you think about your purchase and you need one more hit to consider it, one of the other things to consider when buying a used Brompton is rust. Bromptons aren't rust prone, and in fact can rust up in the internal tubing itself. Usually the external has the protection of the paint, but inside the tube itself isn't protected. So if you look inside a tube, you can usually see a bunch of surface rust, but as a consumer, you have to be able to try and tell the difference between what is surface rust and what is rust to the main frame itself. On mine, I definitely had some rust going on the rear triangle itself. Now, I knew from inspection it was just surface rust, but this is something that you have to consider when buying the bike itself, because it is very, very costly if you have to replace a rear triangle, front fork, or in the worst case scenario, your main frame. At the end of the day, the value in the bike you are purchasing used is with the frame, forks and triangle itself. Everything else is just a consumable part that can technically be changed by you, the end user. Now, if the rust wasn't enough to put you worried, it is hard to inspect because the rear triangle is the most prone to have it, but because it's so built up with components, it's really hard to get a torch in there to really give it a thorough inspection. It's only when those parts are stripped back can you actually fully inspect it yourself. Now, if that isn't enough, there is a bonus one here that might put you off over any cost implements, and that is spiders. Every Brompton I have seen that has been used always tends to have a spider's nest inside the rear frame tubing, and it doesn't just stop there. When I dismantled the bike, I found spider's nests inside the brake levers, I found it inside the gear shifters, I found it inside the luggage block, I found them everywhere. And it does make sense, even if the bike is kept in a garage, spiders are going to love that to create their little nests. I mean, you can clean it all out, but it's not very pretty if you're already afraid of spiders and you're having to clean dead skins of spiders and nests out of the Brompton itself. So unless you can verify it's been really kept well inside a nice environment that is really warm, then you never know what you're going to get. I wouldn't say this video is in any way designed to put you off buying a used Brompton, because I very much advocate for used Bromptons. This is simply to highlight issues that may arise with your used Brompton, and you might not have the skill set to do these, so there is going to be cost assigned to it. Now, you might just want one and you don't care if it makes a noise, but all this is to highlight and educate things you should also consider when buying a used Brompton that you cannot see in front of the seller. I hope this video has been useful, and if it has, please consider subscribing to the channel. If you've taken some at least useful knowledge and tips from it, hit that like button. And if you really want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee on my Buy Me a Coffee page, and all funds from that go to help making this channel produce even better content. As of now, enjoy your night, and thank you for tuning in to The Brompton Guy.